Welcome back to another episode of Mo's Minute. We are here at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, and we're visiting the grave of Admiral Nimitz, Chester W. Nimitz, who is probably the most famous person buried in the Bay Area, I would say. Definitely the most famous person in the cemetery. We'll be back here, but since this is the first time Mo's Minute has been to Golden Gate, I wanted to give you some background information about the cemetery. So it was founded, or established, I should say, between World War I and World War II. And it was originally designed as an expansion to the Presidio National Cemetery, which was already nearing capacity by the 1930s. Both of these were part of the national, the National Military Cemetery System. So now this cemetery is full, and the only way you can be buried here is if you have a spot reserved, or if you are a family member of someone who is already buried here. That's it. So, yeah. So Admiral Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, Texas, and that was on February 24th, 1885. He was of German ancestry, and he was born to Chester Bernhard Nimitz and Anna Josephine Hankey. But his father died 6 months before he was even born. And in 1890, when he was 5 years old, his mom married his uncle, William Nimitz. But the real father figure in his life was his grandfather, who was Charles Nimitz. And his grandfather was a seaman in the German Merchant Marines. Sorry, it's windy. Charles Henry Nimitz was a seaman in the German Merchant Marines. He was also a Texas Ranger, and he fought for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. So, you know, there's something there for a young boy to aspire to. Maybe not the Confederate Army part. I say that, and my great-great-grandfather also fought in the Confederate Army, so I can say that. But there was still something there for a young man to look up to. There's not much known about his early life. He originally wanted to attend West Point to be an officer in the U.S. Army, but there weren't any spots available. So instead, a representative by the name of James Slagan told him that there was a spot available at the Naval Academy, which would be given to the most qualified candidate. Nimitz felt that it was his only opportunity for higher education, so he worked his butt off to get that spot. He got it. He was appointed to the Naval Academy in 1901 at the age of 16, and he graduated in 1905 with distinction. He was ranked 7th out of 114. As soon as he graduated, he embarked on his Navy career. He joined the battleship Ohio and began a 2-year stint as a warrant officer. He then transferred to the cruiser Baltimore in September of 1906, and in January of 1907, he was commissioned to the rank of ensign. And that happened after he completed his required 2-year stint as a warrant officer. And then after that happened, he bounced to a few different ships, and one of these ships was the Decatur. The Decatur was a destroyer. And there was a little bit of trouble in 1908 when Admiral Nimitz ran the Decatur aground on a mud bank. This happened due to a navigational error. He did not check the tide tables, and so he tried to leave when the water was too low, and the Decatur got stuck in the mud. It didn't get moved until the very next day. There was a board of inquiry convened after this incident, but they ultimately found that even though he had erred, there were no punitive measures had to be taken, and instead they just did a letter of reprimand. The reason I say this is because, in all honesty, this is probably the only mistake in what came out to be a very long and rewarding career. The remainder of that decade was marked by ship changes and promotions. He bounced from the Ranger to the Plunger to the Snapper to the Narwhal, and then was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. In 1909, that was when he began instruction in submarines, which became his real swan song. He began commanding subs in 1910, and in 1911, he was commander of the 3rd Submarine Division Atlantic Torpedo Fleet, which means nothing to me, but was evidently quite the honor because he went on to command several different submarines. As we all know, in 1914, World War I broke out. At the time this happened, Nimitz was in Germany studying diesel engines. He came home in 1916, and when we officially entered the war in 1917, he was chief engineer aboard the Nimitz. It was on his watch that the Nimitz performed the first underwater refueling, which I'm sure we can all realize completely changed the face of naval warfare. By the end of the war, he had been appointed Chief of Staff to the Chief of Naval Operations and was awarded a letter of commendation for his service. After the war, he went to Pearl Harbor. That's important later. And he commanded several battleships and cruisers. He also, while he was there, had to conduct an investigation into a sailing incident. The actual details of the incident, I don't really think are too important here. What is important, though, is how he handled it, because he became a model for fair investigations and just boosted his reputation as a leader. In 1922, he moved to Rhode Island to study at the Naval War College. And not long after that, he relocated here to the West Coast, where he established one of the Navy's first officer training programs. By the end of the decade, he was literally all over the world, commanding various submarines. Throughout the 1930s, he continued to excel in basically everything, and that included commanding battle forces to more refueling experiments. By 1935, he was the chief of the Bureau of Navigation, and at the same time, he was promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and President Roosevelt declared war the very next day. Admiral Nimitz was selected to be the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet almost immediately. By the end of the month, he was promoted to the rank of Admiral. Nimitz is a major reason why our second front in the Pacific was victorious. He fought General MacArthur on his plan that likely would have cost more American lives. Nimitz set out to stop the Japanese, even with shortages of ships and supplies. And his idea was to keep island hopping to earn territory, and to avoid fighting the Japanese until we were better prepared. And that decision is resulted in him being given his own theater. He was always a team player, though, and even though he had disagreed with General MacArthur's idea, he still helped him out when it was needed. So Admiral Nimitz's time to shine was with the battles of Coral Sea and the Battle of the Midway. While Battle of Coral Sea was ultimately deemed a loss due to the amount of damage, both battles are now called successes by modern historians and war strategists. The Battle of Midway especially helped stall a Japanese invasion and caused major damage to their fleet. And then it was as a direct result of that and our superior naval air power that we continued to gain victory in the Pacific. Through the rest of the war, he continued to make wise strategic maneuvers and decisions, which included several that destroyed the Japanese hold on the Philippines, which severely damaged their war effort. In December of 1944, Congress established the rank of Fleet Admiral, which is the highest rank in the Navy. Admiral Nimitz was promoted to that rank the very next day. He moved the fleet to Guam for the remainder of the war, and his forces launched attacks on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, both of which are major successes in World War II history. In September of 1945, he signed as U.S. representative when Japan officially surrendered. Afterwards, he served as the Chief of Naval Operations. He retired in 1947, but since Fleet Admiral is a lifetime appointment, he was on duty for the rest of his life. In 1913, he had married Catherine Freeman, and they had 4 children, including Chester William Nimitz Jr., who is an admiral just like his father. In 1947, after Admiral Nimitz's retirement, they moved to Berkeley and then to Treasure Island, where his house still stands. I want to go there someday, but I also don't want to be arrested for trespassing, so we'll see if I can go there. I'll find out. Like I said, he was active for the rest of his life. And it wasn't until 1964 that started to come to an end when he took a fall. And he never really got remobilized after that fall. And then in 1965, he had a stroke. And then he developed pneumonia after the stroke. And he passed away on February 20th, 1966. He was 80 years old. He was 4 days shy of his 81st birthday. Although he was highly decorated because he won several medals, including both the Army and Navy Distinguished Service Medals, he was nothing if not humble. And so he didn't want these accolades listed on his tombstone. Also, his career entitled him to a state funeral in Washington, D.C., which President Kennedy approached him about in the early 1960s. But he didn't want that. He didn't want to be buried in Arlington. He wanted a military funeral here at Golden Gate Cemetery, because a lot of the men who fought and died in the Pacific are buried in this cemetery, and even in death, he wanted to watch over his men. He reserved plots for himself and his wife, and then he asked if the 3 graves next to him could be reserved for 3 of his best friends, all of whom were also admirals. Normally this wasn't done, but they let it slide because it was Admiral Nimitz asking. So now, this little area here right behind me is known as the Nimitz plot. And Admiral Nimitz, or Admiral Spruance, Admiral Lockwood, and Admiral Kelly are all right next to each other by design because they were BFFs. And we are standing here on Admiral Nimitz Drive, too. So that is the story of Admiral Nimitz. And thank you for allowing me the use of my notes. Tune in next time for another episode of Mo's Minute. Bye.